Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's MLA Productivity and Profitability webinar. These webinar series deliver topics pertinent to beef, sheep, and goat producers. My name is Hilary, and I work for the Webinar Coordinator's home circuit. Tonight's topic is managing bloat in cattle. I'll just get onto some housekeeping to start with. This control panel should be at the right-hand corner of your screen right now. There is a red arrow button on the left which collapses and reinstates the control panel. You should be able to hear us, but we cannot hear you. As Bruce goes through the presentation tonight, please type your questions in the box provided. Please make the questions as succinct as possible, and I will relay them to Bruce at the end of the webinar. I will also note that these webinars are recorded and are available on the MLA website at a later date. So tonight's presenter is Professor Bruce Allworth. Bruce graduated from Vet Science from Sydney University in 1984 and after that worked at Massey University in New Zealand. Bruce has worked in the McKinnon Project and has owned and operated a sheep and beef cattle consultancy business based in southern New South Wales and Victoria for 25 years. Bruce is a director of the Fred Morley Centre and Professor of Livestock Systems at Wagga's Charles Sturt University. Bruce also operates his own family farm at Holbrook. There are a few better situated to deliver this webinar. So I will hand over to Bruce to deliver Managing Bloat in Cattle.
Thanks, Hilary. And I think I've got to share my screen. So that should now, Hilary, are you now seeing my screen?
I am. Looks good. Thanks, Bruce.
Okay. I'll fire away. Good evening, everyone. And thanks for attending this webinar. Just by way of introduction, I really don't feel comfortable as an expert on bloat to be giving this webinar. Sandy actually asked me to do it last year in about this time last year, and I said, look, I'm really not up to it. And the main reason I'm not up to it is I run a beef herd here and I lose them from bloat. And even worse still, I gave a talk on bloat 5 years ago, and the day I was giving a talk on bloat, we lost an animal, and I've just lost 2 animals today with bloat. So I'm not quite sure why somebody who is losing animals to bloat is giving you a webinar on how to manage bloat, but I will do my best to cover everything. So I'm just putting that out there first up, and I will give you the key messages on the next slide. So if you've decided on that introduction you don't want to listen, have a look at the key messages and then log off. But hopefully I've got some important things, and I guess that the most important thing is that what works for you is probably the most cost-effective option, and that's really the outcome of what I'll be talking about. I want to raise the issue of whether the bloat risk is changing, and I'm going to talk about what you can do this year and then what to think about in the long term. And probably from my little spray I'm going to have at MLA, who is putting on this webinar, probably you'll see there's a call for research. So just in terms of the key messages, the most important one, and I'll have these again at the end, but what works for you will be the most cost-effective option because losing cattle is not anything that you can do to prevent losing cattle will almost always be cost-effective. Capsules may be available in 2 years. They certainly won't be available for this year, and probably for most people not next year. And possibly, if everything goes according to plan, Elanco may have capsules back on the market in a couple of years' time. Blocks, licks, liquids are effective if the animal consume them, and hay is good too, but you will still have losses with these less effective methods. And they certainly are less effective, and we'll go through why they are. The other difficulty is that almost anything that prevents bloat is likely to decrease your production. And I guess one of the things about bloat is it really is a consequence of our high production system. As Simon, who works with me, said, we've got our cattle living on the edge. And I guess that's what we're all struggling with. the trying to get the cattle putting on the most amount of weight, but keeping them alive. And I'm going to raise the issue of whether we should have alternate species sown into some of our pastures, especially with lucerne, and that I think probably more research in this area is justified, but I've got a vested interest in there, so I probably shouldn't say that because we're keen to do some research into bloat. So I just want to go through a couple of things about bloat. For most of you, I'm guessing this will be fairly straightforward. Do we understand bloat? Absolutely. We know what happens with bloat. It's a gas accumulation related to high quality, and it's usually legume, but it does not need to be legume. Brassicas, even ryegrass has been associated with bloat, and it results in an accumulation of frothy gas. And the relevance is not of the gas, but it's the frothy gas that the animals can't then get rid of that gas. Instead of just being gas, it's got a mucus or a frothy layer that stops them being able to burp it up. And the result of that is that pressure builds up and they get asphyxiation and die very quickly. That's about what I'm an expert in, that they do die very quickly. Interestingly, it's probably the animals with a slower rate of ingesta with a slower rate of passage that lead to bloat. It's not due to animals overeating. Can we treat bloat? Yes, we can, and we have pretty good success at actually treating animals that are alive with bloat. Most cases, if you give them some sort of oil, such as a vegetable oil or a paraffin oil. I got a text from a vet colleague this afternoon which says, Bruce, will you fail me if I ask about diesel tonight? I'm not going to tell you what treatments do or don't work. There are a large variety of treatments that will work. Anything that disrupts the frothy gas works. So diesel certainly works, but putting diesel into an animal that's going to be consumed is probably not something that's that I will be advising. And so I've got there, don't tell me all your treatments. If you've got something that works and you keep the animal alive, well and good. But basically 100 to 250 mils of vegetable oil, probably 100 to 150 mils of paraffin oil. If the animal is alive, it will almost always save them. If they're severe and you can't get them down to the yards and they've just fallen over, you can certainly stab them and physically release that gas. Putting in a little needle won't do anything at all. You really need to make a decent opening, and usually you have to then treat them with antibiotics. But the treatment is only effective when the animals are alive, and most of the ones that we seem to find are usually dead. And the third question is, can we prevent bloat? And the answer is mostly, but in my view, that's not good enough. And it's a very frustrating disease, certainly in my experience. I had a vet ring me last week. I didn't speak to this person. I don't know the full history, but the vet rang to say that they'd just come from a well-managed farm. They were grazing young cattle on canola. They had hay racks in the paddock. There was a runoff Phalaris subclover, a smaller paddock that the cattle had access to, and bloat blocks were in the paddock. There were 3 animals had died, and when the 3rd animal died, the owner got the vet out to do a PM, and the vet, who's a very competent vet, diagnosed bloat based on the examination and ruled out nitrates, which would be a differential, and enterotoxemia, and really annoyingly there was also evidence of hay in the rumen. And so what do you recommend in these sort of cases? I mean, clearly you can say don't graze the canola, but how can you possibly have not done, in my view, everything here has been done that we would recommend to try and minimise that risk. So it just shows the dilemma that you can have when you're dealing with bloat. So as I touched on in the introduction, we want rapidly growing cattle. Pastures with legumes achieve this. and they achieve this in two ways. The value of the legume with the high protein content is useful on its own, and in addition, the legumes fix nitrogen, as Jim would have talked about. And unfortunately, I missed Jim's presentation last week, and that would have then promotes grass growth to increase production. Generally, we're aiming for very high quality pastures, and most of the pastures aren't monocultures, which is always a no-no. Lucerne probably is for most people, with few weeds in it, but most of us have not only got weeds, but we've got a mixture of grasses and legumes. And the most effective prevention at the moment that I can work out is a probiotic, or an ionophore, which, if you want to say it properly, it's an antibiotic. And that's a bit of an issue because that will disqualify you from some of the programs that are out there around grass-fed beef. So there's a few issues there around bloat. And obviously the other issue is, as producers, it's really quite a draining disease. You go out there just hoping that you don't find another one dead, and after a week you get pretty relaxed and you think everything's fine, and then suddenly another one dies. So it is quite a strain for us as well. And what I find most frustrating is the current advice is general and not necessarily helpful. I will hopefully in the next 10 minutes give you some much more detailed information, but I'm just sort of setting the scene here. So I've actually taken this off the MLA website last Friday. So this is what's recommended as far as bloat in beef cattle. It says that pastures can be assessed to determine the risk of bloat. I think that's written everywhere. I will defy anyone to assess pastures at the moment in our district and say animals won't get bloat on that pasture. It's very hard to assess pastures. It's easy to say when you see a dead animal and you go and look in and you say, gee, that's a high risk pasture. But beforehand, it's quite hard to know what the risk of the pasture is. So sure, you can make an assessment, but it's not as simple as it says. The strategies that are mentioned are to avoid grazing high risk pastures. Well, if all the pastures on your farm are high risk, that becomes pretty tricky. It says slow your rotation round and graze more mature pastures. That's easier said than done, and is going to take a fair while to implement. Daily application of bloat oil on pasture may be cost effective in some situations. That's a dairy cattle recommendation coming out in beef cattle. And if you can do it, as they say there, it works pretty well, but most people won't be moving their cattle daily and be able to put bloat oil on the small bit of pasture that they move the cattle to. But if you happen to be rotating cattle on a daily basis, you can apply bloat oil. It says use bloat capsules. Bloat capsules haven't been available for the last 7 years, so that's useless because we cannot use bloat capsules. And it suggests incorporating bloat-resistant legumes. And again, that's pretty difficult. So I'm just really highlighting that if you go looking for information, there's plenty out there, and it's mostly not very useful in the beef situation that I see at this stage. I'm often asked about vaccination and also confirming the diagnosis. Does a clostridial vaccination, either 5-in-1 or 7-in-1, stop bloat? And I've got there no and yes. Bloat is not associated with a clostridial disease, so vaccinating will not stop bloat. However, enterotoxemia or pulpy kidney does look very similar to bloat and occurs under almost the same situations. And certainly a number of producers have said to me, I used to have trouble with bloat and then I vaccinated and I haven't had trouble with bloat since. Almost certainly in those cases, they were diagnosing, what they were diagnosing as bloat was enterotoxemia. I'm not aware how common enterotoxemia is in cattle. We know it's very common in sheep, particularly those that are rapidly growing. I don't have a feel for how common it is in cattle, but the only thing I can say is that if you're getting a response to 5-in-1, then it's probably enterotoxemia. The other thing I will hasten to add is that the cost of 5-in-1 is so cheap that if you're experiencing a bloat, you've got conditions which are suitable for enterotoxemia, it will not hurt those animals to give them an extra 5-in-1. Interestingly, enterotoxemia is probably the only clostridial disease that we vaccinate against where the vaccine does not last for 12 months. It only lasts for 3 to 4 months at best. So if you've weaned cattle, as people in our area typically do, in, say, February, probably given their second vaccination, given one at marking and another one at weaning, then June's 4 months away, July's 5 months away, those animals could well be susceptible to enterotoxemia. And I mentioned in the case study the 3 things that we're really looking at, and obviously there's a whole host of different disease problems that could cause animals to die, but the typical ones we'd be seeing on the pastures where animals are dying from bloat will be bloat, enterotoxemia or pulpy kidney, and nitrite poisoning. And that's really what you've got to differentiate. Enterotoxemia we can diagnose reasonably easily, and nitrite is easily diagnosed. Bloat is actually very difficult to confirm other than to rule out the others and find what you think are fairly typical rapid blowing up. But of course, if an animal's been dead for more than 2 to 3 hours, particularly with a clostridial disease, they can blow up very quickly. So I'll get on to what you can do. I just want to have a bit of a go at MLA, and it's probably unfair because they're sponsoring it. But there has been no research. I checked with MLA last Friday, and there's been no research on bloat in the last 11 years, and they're unsure before that. This is despite the GHD report showing that it was the second most important disease in southern beef herds. This was based on 2010 and 2011 livestock numbers, and presumably the prices were probably in 2013. And it also assumed that every herd in high rainfall areas was affected by bloat, which just shows how common this problem really is. And I would suspect now that the disease is costing a lot more because that work assumed, even though capsules weren't available, the costings were all done, assuming you could that you use capsules in a proportion of herds, and that reduced the losses down. And importantly, this 76.8 million did not include the costs associated with avoiding high-risk pastures. And specifically, they said we have not costed losses from forced avoidance of high-risk pastures crops because they were too difficult to estimate. So those losses are just because you've got to graze more mature or less or pastures that promote lower growth rate for the rest of the animals to stop the hopefully small percent that are going to die, and that can be quite costly. We put in a proposal in 2016 to MLA to do some research about bloat, and we were informed that despite it being rated quite highly, it can be managed. And our proposal uses large-scale outbreaks as a justification. One would hope most southern systems are proactive anyway in avoiding this. So the response we got from MLA was that they didn't think bloat was worthwhile doing research on, and my little reply is written there, which I needn't mention. So clearly, given what I think is a fairly important issue certainly in our farming system, it's a shame that we can't get a little bit more buy-in from MLA with our research dollars. But that's the end of my rant. Okay, on to the really critical thing. What can you do about bloat prevention? And I guess at the moment, capsules are not available. I'll talk about them in a minute. You can use some sort of anti-foaming agent, and the typical one that occurs in most of the blocks is ethoxylate, and it's also the basis of pteric oil, which is the other product that's usually mentioned in a lot of the blocks. And if animals consume that will prevent frothy bloat from occurring. They need to get around about 10 to 30 grams a day, and that is effective, but they need to get it every day. It's not protective. It physically works by breaking down the foam so that they can get rid of the gas. And if it's not present in the system, if they haven't just ingested it, then it's not going to be effective, which is why dairy producers put it on the flanks of cows twice a day or once a day, why they use things like pasture dosing daily, and why they put in the water daily. So daily treatments of that are useful. Obviously, the block technology allows potentially for animals to get it daily, provided they're eating the block. The substance that was in the capsules, the Elanco capsules, was monensin, and it's an ionophore or an antibiotic, and it works by preventing the production of the foaming gas by changing the microbe population in the rumen, and so you just don't get the gas produced. It takes around about 10 and more likely 14 days for that to occur. So if you've lost an animal for bloat and you suddenly go and whip out some monensin blocks, those animals are still susceptible to bloat for the next 10 to 14 days. So animals need to be on monensin for around about 2 weeks prior to you expecting to have bloat for that to be effective. And of course, hay is useful in conjunction with either of these or on its own. People often say to me, well, how much hay do I need to offer the animals? And I have no idea, because I can't find anything that has specifically looked at hay with bloat. But as a general rule, we would be thinking about 10 to 20% of the diet. So if you've got a 300 kilogram animal, it's eating 3% of it body weight as its maximum daily intake, then that would be equivalent to around about 1 to 2 kilograms per head per day. That should say 0.9, 9 kilograms, yeah. So that's 9 kilograms is what it's eating, and the 10% of that is 0.9, 20% is 1.8, so I've rounded that to 1 to 2 kilograms per head per day hay. So they're the immediate things that we can look at, and the long term, the capsules were effective and are still on sale in New Zealand. In clover situations, they weren't effective with lucerne, and that's why they were taken off the market. I've got most of my information from talking with Craig Stevenson at Elanco, and it appears that there's a reasonable likelihood that post-2021 capsules will be back on the market, but whether or not they can produce enough capsules for the likely demand, and they've still got to jump through a few hoops with registration, which they're attempting to do in New Zealand this spring. So that's why I've got a question mark there. And the other thing is some sort of thoughts that you can have about changing the current pasture mixes, particularly with lucerne. If your problem is on lucerne pasture, whether or not it's going to be cost effective to put something in there that's going to lessen the bloat risk of that pasture by having some sort of grass or something in that pasture. The other couple of points there is a few things that people have raised, and I don't have the answers to, but do dry springs promote more at-risk pastures? Are the fact that rhizobia are not fixing as much nitrogen, is that resulting in less grass being produced in our pastures? So we're still fertilising with superphosphate for the clovers, but they're not fixing as much nitrogen, and so we're getting a more clover-dominant pasture for a longer period of time. I certainly think that over the last 5 to 6 years, we've been getting an increased length of our risk period. We used to consistently, if we were going to lose animals, lose them late July, early August here. Now we seem to lose them from the beginning of May till the beginning of October. And other pastures, we don't know a lot about grazing canola. certainly brassicas in general have been reported as being mildly bloat causing, but not nearly as much as the legumes. And I've just put a quote there from the Department of Victoria suggesting that on beef properties, the more effective control methods that are used on dairy farms are not feasible, so that you need to use these less effective things. So even though blocks and licks are effective, their problem is you can't guarantee the animal is getting it day in and day out, which is what's needed to stop bloat with any of these treatments. So if we just look, just make sure that I've covered off on all these points. We've got alcohol ethoxylate. The cattle have got to eat it. It only protects for bloat, plus anything else that you've got in the additive. It's not doing anything in terms of the growth of the animals. It's just keeping your animal alive if they're eating it. Monensin is one of the ionophores. Rumensin is the trade name that it's marketed. There's a number of different companies that sell it. The capsules delivered 320 milligrams per head per day, and you need a minimum, according to Craig, of 200 milligrams per head per day for monensin sodium monensin to prevent bloat. And that's a pretty important figure you'll see on the next slide. It is an antibiotic. It takes 10 to 14 days to be effective. You get around about a 10 to 12% growth promoting effect by using monensin, but it does disqualify you from some QA programs. And in some of the products, a couple of the liquid products and the blocks, there's also another ionophore, Bovatec, and it works in a similar way. And again, it's exactly the same. Being an ionophore, it is an antibiotic. So if I can just give you some examples of what you might be doing. I've just taken this for a 300 kilogram weaner that you might have on your place. And I've only just taken these names. They were available at one of the local shops in Holbrook. So I just got the prices from them just to have a look. And as you'll see, they're all fairly similar. And probably the biggest thing is what return you get from them. So you can use something like a bloat block with alcohol ethoxylate in it. They've got to eat around about 100 grams per head per day, and that works out to give them 10 grams. I said you need 10 to 30 grams of the alcohol ethoxylate. They've got to eat 100 grams of the block. That works out at about 22 cents a day. Weather Pro Prevent has got sodium monensin in it, and to get your 300 milligrams per day, which is what's recommended, those animals need to consume about 100 grams per day of that loose lick. We find that they probably aren't quite consuming at that rate. So I've just had a look here. If they drop down to 70 grams per head per day, they'll still get the 200 milligrams, but every animal's got to be eating that 70 grams per head per day. And if it averages 70 grams, then there's probably quite a few in there that are only eating 40 or 50 grams, and that wouldn't be bloat. That wouldn't be stopping bloat. And this is the disadvantage with blocks, is compared with something like a capsule, that you can't guarantee the animal's getting it. Obviously, with any of these monensin products, they're probably putting on 10 to 12% increased growth rate, particularly if they're already on good feed, which they probably are if they're blowing. So that probably equates, if they're growing at about 1.2 kilograms per head per day, that's around about 0.1 of a kilogram. And you can tell me what that's worth, but it's probably somewhere in the order of 30 to 40 cents per day across the herd, which more than covers the cost of the supplement if they're eating it. I mean, in that way it's useful, but you have disqualified yourself from some of these premiums that you might be able to get in some of these programs. I've looked at one of the liquids, and again, it's a little bit hard to do all the sums on them. They don't give you necessarily all the information, but essentially it comes out at about the same cost, around that slightly cheaper with the liquids, somewhere around 14 to 15 cents per head per day. But when we're looking at this compared with the price of the animal, the only thing that really matters is that it's actually effective. The animals are consuming it at the right rate, and so you are getting prevention. So I'm certainly not about to advocate that you all ought to change to one product or another product. What's out there is out there, and it's a matter of what works in your system, and I'd welcome any comments as we come to the questions. I'm almost over time. I'm not going to go through this. I've just included for completeness. I know John Webware had a client who actually set this system up on a beef farm. It's a really good system. It works really well. There's one catch, and that is that you've got to refill the container every day and before the cattle start drinking the water. Works well on a dairy farm, but I guess some of you get up earlier than I do, but the whole reason you farm beef cattle and not dairy cattle is so you don't have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, I'm guessing. So there are different ways, and I'm just mentioning this because for the number of people here, one of these might be useful to you. So hopefully that gives you just a bit of an idea of what you need to look up there. I've mentioned these couple of things in the long term, and I just put this slide up in case I'd glossed over it before. So I'm not going to talk any further about those points, but I've really put them up there because I'd welcome any comments or questions on this. And the final thing I want to say is that I get asked a lot of things about what about the weather conditions, and my understanding is that we still need to do a bit of work around this. I see some conflicting information from the Grain Court Liquid Feeds did a lit review, and they came up that morning with dew on pasture, overcast, windy days frequently associated with bloat events, and heifers 3 times more likely to die than mature cows. Probably put that on our place at about 100 times more likely, and that's heifers, non-pregnant heifers. Jerseys more susceptible than Friesians, but we don't know anything in terms of susceptibility within beef herds. Given that it has to do with the rate of digestion, it's quite possible that there is a selection benefit, but I would have thought most people, particularly most of the bull breeders I talk to, have already been selecting for resistance to bloat because they're the ones they can offer you. The others have died. So I'm not convinced that there's a way forward there. Obviously, there's a lot of interaction with plant factors under stress conditions and lushness, and the weather then influences both the plant through that stress and lushness, and also the animals that sometimes they will or won't be eating depending on the weather conditions, which will all influence their likelihood of getting bloat. So the final slide before I wrap up is that there is opportunity for, I think, some research in bloat. We've been looking at trying to develop an early warning system with these collars that are now coming out, and now they're tags. Unfortunately, we put these collars on a group of animals, and none of the animals died from bloat, and about 10% of the animals in the adjoining paddock died from bloat. We didn't have collars on those ones. It's the way it works with research. But I think there's something as these systems come along that would be really useful. The idea is that you'd get an alert at least an hour before an animal's likely to die, and you're able to do something about it. We need to revisit what's going on these risky pastures. No one, to my knowledge, has really looked at this over the last 20 to 30 years, and we've certainly changed a lot of the agronomics of what we're growing, even just in terms of the phalaris and the clovers that we're now using, and possibly sowing other species. There's some more rumen physiology work that needs to be done, and I don't think we have a good understanding for the extent of bloat that it is occurring, but perhaps that's just my take on things. So that's just some examples, just showing that there is plenty of questions there to be answered. So I'll wrap up there, and again, I'm just putting up the key messages, which I think I've hammered mostly to you, but really, if you've got a system that works, that's good. If your system's not quite working, perhaps a couple of things that I've said tonight will help you tweak it. But as I said right at the beginning, I lost cattle today. I'm not the expert on how to save everything. I'm really sorry about that. So I think at that point, Hilary, I know I've gone over. My apologies. I'll wrap up there.
No, thanks. Thanks, Bruce, for that jam-packed presentation, and thank you very much for putting some of those management options up there with costings around them, because I think that gave people a bit more of a managerial aspect towards it. I'll just give Bruce a little bit of a break. So if you do have to leave now, there will be a survey that pops up at the end of your webinar, as you exit the webinar. If you could please take a few minutes to do the survey. It provides good feedback for Bruce, MLA, and us at Home Circuit to make sure the webinars are hitting the right notes. All right, we'll jump into some questions now. So if you do have some, please type them in the question box provided. We've had a few come through, a few good ones so far. We'll start with Matt. Bruce, is the bloat incidence related to high potassium to sodium ratios and high potassium to calcium plus magnesium ratios in forages in the rumen?
Yes, it definitely is. So high potassium is definitely a risk factor with bloat, but it is not the only factor involved. So it's not just as simple as saying lower that, but certainly changing it. And it's one of the things that I think probably happens with Monensin as well, in the way that it changes the digestion. But that is certainly a factor in there, and certainly putting on things like potash fertiliser can be an issue.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Matt also has another one. Have people experienced more bloat with frost and higher forage nitrate levels?
So I guess the real problem is, as a scientist and a supposed expert talking here tonight, I'm meant to be going off information that is has been scientifically shown that there's a risk factor there or not, and there just hasn't been the work done on that. So we had people reporting a bloat in our area over the last 3 to 4 weeks before any frosts occurred. We've certainly seen bloat since the frosts have occurred, and it may or may not increase it. It makes sense that frost increases it. It probably slows the grass growth down more, so leaving the clover exposed. But I really just can't. I'm just not going to say that the bloat risk is just associated with when you have the frosts, but I guess most people can comment within their own districts at what they're seeing.
Thanks, Bruce. So a few questions coming in about different breeds. I think Brian sums it up pretty well here. Despite your comment about not knowing any breed different susceptibility, have you heard of any difference between Indicus and Taurus? Would Santa by Angus be less susceptible than Angus?
Yeah, that's a great question. And look, I'm sorry, I just don't know. I haven't seen any data around that. For some reason, I'm going to get into trouble whatever I say here, but for some reason I'm thinking that they probably are less susceptible, and only because their growth rates are possibly slower, and perhaps that is associated with it, but I really don't know. Yeah, that's just, I'm sorry, perhaps I should know, but I don't.
That's fine, thanks. Thanks for the questions. The next one from Faye, what is the early warning alert? What are the symptoms?
So in terms of the sort of two questions there, are there early warning alert at the moment that we can use? And that is really just going and looking at your cattle and seeing whether any are blowing up on the left-hand side. And getting some sort of, I mean, the early warning system I use is people ring me and tell me they start losing cattle from bloat, and I start doing something about it. So that's not very useful. But what I was talking about specifically in the talk, Sean McGrath, who I work with, had put up a proposal to MLA for us to try and look at the activity level. Animals that get bloat stop eating. They, prior to them getting bloat, their actual intake decreases and their activity levels change. And there's a big move, and I think within 5 to 10 years, most of our cattle will have, rather than an NLIS tag in them, or perhaps in addition to it, a second tag which is monitoring the activity of the animal every 10 to 20 seconds. And those alerts can tell you when the animal's in heat, they can tell you when they're calving, if they're having trouble calving, and hopefully, but we don't know this yet, whether or not they're about to get bloat or die from bloat, and to at least give us a chance to get down and do something rather than just what we're doing at the moment, which is, I think they'll be all right, and then there's one with legs up again in the morning. So that's what we were looking at, but at the moment that does not exist. We were just trying to do a bit of research around that, and we didn't get it funded through MLA, but we certainly proceeded with the research because we thought it was really important. But as I say, we picked by luck or bad luck or bad management, we picked the wrong group of animals to put the tags on. So we got no data out of that trial on that.
Well, look forward to when that does occur. The next question, is there a better time of day to move cattle to fresh pasture in a rotational grazing situation?
That is a great question. My instinctive answer, and I don't know this, but my instinctive answer is to do it earlier on in the day, not at the end of the day. And I don't know why I say that, but probably the worst experience I had with bloat was moving cattle at the end of the day, and the next morning there were 8 dead in the paddock. So I'm just thinking that there's a lot of pressure on the system in the early hours when it's cold, and that may be adding to it. But the other thing is that if you do it, at 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, you can at least be watching those cattle in the afternoon if they are starting to blow up, and at least take some action.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I think that answers your question as well, Rodney.
These are just fantastic questions. I'm feeling really inadequate not being able to give you definitive answers. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Bruce. The next one from Jesse. What is the effectiveness of a molasses/terric mixed in a roller drum?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that's a good way of doing it. And all the terric oil, the alcohol ethoxylate, is not palatable. So all of the blocks or licks or liquids all mix it in with something like molasses and usually salt, which is also good for the animals. And so long as the animals are eating it, if they're getting, I think the bee's knees is for them to be getting 30 grams a day, but my understanding is if they're getting around 10 to 15 grams a day of the alcohol ethoxylate, then that will be protective. But it comes down to the same thing. Is every animal getting it? Most people might lose 1 to 3% of their animals over a period of time. And you just wonder whether those 1 to 3% are animals, even with the blocks or licks, roller drums out there, if they're the ones just not getting the adequate amount. Because we're fairly confident that if they get these treatments, it will stop the bloat within that 24-hour period.
Okay. The next one from Tammy.
Hillary, I should just say that my example list was by no means exhaustive. There are a whole range of products out there. I think one reference said there's more than 3,000 products which have actually got a terric oil base around the world. There are a whole lot of products. They're really just broken up into the ones that work directly on the foam and break it down and allow the animal to burp effectively, and they need to be given daily to have that effect on the foam. And then the other group of these ionophores, which work on producing less of the foam, again, they need to be given daily, and that's where you need around about the 200, preferably 300 milligrams. So the basic treatments that are around fall into those two groups.
Okay, I think you've just answered a question. How long are ionophores effective for? So they have to be administered daily by the sound.
Yeah, my understanding is they need to be doing it daily, and my experience is we're actually using a weather prevent at the moment, and we're still losing cattle, and I can only think they're consuming, we've worked out 70 grams per head per day, which is the bare minimum, and I can only assume that the odd animal that we lose is just not getting sufficient of it. They have it accessed every day out in the tubs there. So that's an assumption, as I say. I don't actually know. You probably can't look, Hillary, but if Craig Stevenson is on the line, he might actually be able to answer it. He could put it in the chat if he was listening.
Yeah, I'll just, if you are.
So here's one of the other difficulties. I mean, as an expert, and I can say this to everyone, what we do if we're asked to give a presentation is we try and look up all the information we can, and it's really quite hard finding information, and the people who have most of the information at the moment are the companies producing the products, which is why I went to them and talked to them about it. And they usually have some very good information on it. And clearly, Elanco have done a lot of work around their capsule. And so that's why Craig's got such good knowledge of this. And there's just very little published on this outside of America and the UK over the last 15 or 20 years. And in fact, the main text I use, I wasn't able to, it's still over in Wagga, was written in about 1978, which is what we're still using. And that's pretty frustrating. And that's why I get a little bit frustrated about the lack of current research, given it's a problem. But I mean, I think we had 250 people logged in here at one point, which to me suggests that people are pretty interested in bloat, and it's a bit of a problem. But maybe I'm biased there. So
no, I definitely,
sorry.
Particularly in a year like this, Bruce, there's been a lot of interest coming out of this. So we'll try and rip the Band-Aid off as quickly as possible for you then. Does spraying with MCPA degas or lower bloat potential in high clover pastures / clover dominant pastures post-fire? Big question.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess it depends on what other grasses come up if you spray with MCPA, what rates you're doing to really knock down on the clover. And I don't know enough about it to say, and I don't know what the specific effect of MCPA is on the clover and what it does with bloat. And that sort of thing would be really interesting to know. And I'm pretty confident that sort of work has not been done. And that's the sort of thing that we ought to be doing to see whether or not there's better methods than what we're currently doing.
Thanks for the question, Tammy. So the next one from Steve, which is another strap yourself in, Bruce. Can you speak about balancing oxygen, hydrogen and protein in the ration? Are there any studies looking at bloat occurrence, set stock versus rotational graze?
Yeah, can I talk about that? I mean, the protein issue is possibly a bit of a red herring with bloat, but not necessarily with other things. But it's actually specifically why I had a slide up there on the research saying that we needed to do more work on the rumen physiology, because the majority of our work that was done on bloat was done 30 or 40 years ago, and we've got much better techniques now for following different chemicals in the system that would probably answer all of these questions reasonably succinctly, but if we were able to look at it now. I mean, the basic stuff on bloat was trying to work out why did animals die from it, and how do you stop it? And we've got all that basic information. Now what we've got is a situation where we're applying all the knowledge that we had and we're not being effective. So that says to me we need to go back and look at these sort of things, and all the suggestions. I mean, what I didn't put up was all the different hypotheses about the different levels of the different bacteria in the rumen, what they produce and how that all works. But I think we need to revisit some of that and make sure that it's actually consistent with some of the other things that we now understand much better in terms of protein and energy nutrition within the cow.
Thank you. Thanks for the questions.
The cow was generic. That was in cattle. No, we're talking mostly about younger cattle here.
All good. The next one. Hi, Bruce. In the Riverina, when is the safest time to graze lucerne?
When it doesn't cause much, when it doesn't allow you to grow your animals at all. I mean, basically, lucerne, if you're getting good growth rates on your lucerne, then you're at risk with bloat. As the lucerne plant matures, the bloat risk goes down and your growth rates go down. So from a production point of view, I'm going to be telling you to graze your lucerne at the time that's optimal for both the lucerne and the animal, and that's going to be at a high risk for your bloat. And anything else I tell you will sound good, but you'll go out and you'll get sick of doing it pretty quickly because your animals aren't performing as well. The general recommendation with lucerne is to make sure that they've got access to hay at the same time. The difficulty is that animals will eat a small amount of hay, but not necessarily all animals. If the lucerne's highly palatable, they will really rip into the lucerne, and then you've still got the risk. And I mean, most of the operators I've dealt with are very, very good operators. They're very astute. I don't actually have lucerne, but they've got lucerne, and they really struggle with the management of it, despite knowing a hell of a lot more about bloat than I do. So it is definitely the number one thing, and the problem is why the capsules went off the market is they didn't pay out under lucerne, whereas they did under subclover. So that's where the problems were with the capsules as well. So my apologies, I'm not really answering a lot of these questions.
That's all right. The next, just following on from that, is it unusual to get bloat from lucerne hay?
Yes, surprisingly, it is unusual to get a bloat from lucerne hay, but I wouldn't be putting lucerne hay in as my hay option on lucerne. But it's just because it's matured, and it is pretty unusual. I can't think of a case. The other thing about hay, and one of the earlier questions was possibly angling at this, and I didn't comment on it, but one of the things that hay does is it makes the animal produce more saliva. The saliva has a buffering effect and probably decreases the amount of foam, but again, I'm not 100% sure on that. It makes logic. A number of people have read it, but there's no primary bit of research that establishes that that's how the hay is being effective.
Okay, the next one from John. Why not just tip bloat oil into the water troughs in higher risk paddocks?
Yeah, that's great. And I sort of skipped over that, which was my own fault because I was running out of time because I'd ranted about MLA. That works really well, but you've got a major issue. You've got to have them on only on a water source, a trough water source. You basically need one trough in a paddock. You need to put the bloat oil in at the right rate, because as water runs back into the trough, unless you're standing there all day and all night, it then dilutes it. So you can't get the right concentration. So the ones that drink it to begin with at the concentration put in get what you've worked out as the appropriate amount, and then the concentration decreases as the water runs in. So these Peter dispensers are actually worked out to do that, and they'll last up to 24 hours, developed in New Zealand to actually basically give you a more consistent amount. But if you could put it into the water source, your main water source that was running out, and it was filling the troughs, then that would work fine. If you had a single tank and you filled that tank up and let the tank completely empty, and then let the tank fill up. But then the next problem is that the intake of the animals in terms of water intake can be very variable, particularly when you consider that grasses have 80% water and animals don't have much of a requirement for water over the winter when we're seeing bloat. If this was a summer problem, water treatments would probably be much more effective. But for all of those reasons, I don't know whether I've explained that well enough, and perhaps I haven't thought about it as much as the questioner has, but it's quite complicated treating water with terric oil or one of these effective treatments and getting the right concentration to the cattle. Hopefully that made sense.
It did. Thanks, Bruce. So Craig has just written in. Thank you very much, Craig. He said that monensin does need to be consumed daily to prevent bloat, and it will take at least 7 days and more likely 10 to 14 days once you start feeding to have altered the rumen microbes sufficiently to prevent bloat. Once a farmer stops offering monensin, the rumen microbes will revert back within days and the animals will again be susceptible to bloat.
Yeah, thanks, Craig.
Yeah.
He's right on. He really knows what he's talking about on these things. So thanks for those comments. I think I got a tick from him from what I said, Hillary, based on that, but he certainly confirmed it needs to be daily.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Craig. All right. Can you give a mixture of teric acid and ionophores?
Yeah, but there's no value in giving. They're working on two different systems, so you're not adding into it. And you certainly can. There's no problems with doing that. You've just doubled your cost, and maybe that's a sensible thing to do is to have both of them out. I'm pretty sure I've actually had a couple of clients that have done that, and they haven't really noticed a difference, and they've reverted back to one. But there's no logical reason why you can't have both systems operating.
All right, thanks.
Long as the animal's got to be eating them, and that's the only thing is if they'll take both of them at the same time, then that would still be fine.
Okay, sorry, Bruce. What are the tricks to stabbing bloat cattle as a last resort? Is a knife sufficient, or is it worth spending the money on a bloat knife? And we can refer this question if you want, Bruce.
No. Yeah. It's very simple. Look, the thing is that if you find an animal in extremis that's just about to go down, or you're trying to get it down to the yards and it goes down in front of you, you don't have time to muck around. A pocket knife, the main thing is you go for it's very, very simple. You go for the highest point on the rumen where it's sticking out. And they stick out and it gets higher as you go up. You go for the highest point because that's going to lead to the least amount of contamination as it goes down. The lower you go down, the more ingest you're going to get going inside the animal, and the more likely there is to be infection. So it's simply the highest point, and you need to, at the very least, put a knife in and twist it, not just make an incision with a knife. It's really just a stab straight in. If a vet was on hand and was doing it, they would have something called a trocar, which is just a glorified enormous needle with a very, very large bore that allows it to come out and makes a neat stabbing hole. But I would think for all intents and purposes, producers will not have anything other than a knife, and that will be sufficient. I'll guarantee that if you get the animal while it's alive, you will save the animal at that time. Whether or not you subsequently save the animal depends how big a wound you've made, and then whether it needs to be sewn up or treated by a vet, or whether it'll just get better by itself.
All right. Good. Thank you, Bruce. Okay, the next one from Phil. Could you confinement feed hay in the morning, then let out for 4 hours feeding the high-risk legume in the afternoon before confining in the paddock with hay only each day?
Yeah, absolutely. And therein lies the problem with bloat, is you can develop a system. I mean, the other thing you can do is just confinement feed them the whole time and not even put them on the pasture. But we're trying to graze them on the pasture to grow them at a certain growth rate, and that will knock around your growth rates. If you get enough hay in that you alter the amount of that they're taking in, then you're going to decrease your growth rate. it's quite hard to get enough hay in to decrease the amount of clover-based pasture that they're eating, given that they can eat up to 3% of their body weight as their maximum intake, as a rough approximation. So they can go out there and eat. What happens with animals is they only spend a certain number of hours a day eating, but if there's more feed on offer, or the feed is going to cause a problem, it can cause a problem reasonably quickly. And had this vet not rung me last week, I would have answered that question much more confidently and said, look, if you've got hay in them, they're not going to bloat. But I'm absolutely convinced this animal he diagnosed with bloat, which had hay in it, did die from bloat. And that was really counter to what my understanding is. So, yes, there are systems, and what I'm encouraging everyone to do is to think about their system and what suits them, given that at the moment these are the options we have in the absence of capsules, and it's working around them the best way you think is possible.
So Phil's just sent through and he wants to know your thoughts on the possibility of a walkthrough weighing setup, giving a dose of a prevention supplement before the doors open to a high-risk legume paddock.
Yeah. So I'm guessing, does it drop a bit of oil on them on their flank? You know, that sort of thing would work. That's a great idea, Phil. So as they walk through, but then you've got to be moving them every day over the walkout weighing. So if you're doing that every day, that would work. If you're only doing it, you know, you're trying to keep them in the paddock for 2 or 3 days, that's not going to work. So they've got to go through it every day. And as you can see, this system works really well in dairy systems because they're getting them in twice a day and they can do something. But for us, we're trying to leave these animals alone or in paddocks for several days mostly. But again, what I'm trying to explain is how it all works. If you can work that into your system like that, that's brilliant.
Yeah, thank you. Just a few more, Bruce. Thanks for hanging around. There is evidence of chicory, plantain, and arrowleaf clover assisting in the reduction of bloat. Have you ever worked on this theory?
Well, my understanding is that plantain increases the risk. So the only stuff I've seen on plantain said that you can get increased bloat with plantain. I've certainly looked at, we've actually planted plantain in amongst some of our pastures, and they're still the pastures that we're still losing cattle on. But that's the sort of thinking that we need to be doing. I'm just not sure whether chicory and plantain specifically are going to help as much as I thought they might, because the data I'm seeing says that is the opposite to what the question's suggesting, but that might be my ignorance. But I'd have to check up on it, and as I say, I don't think there's been a lot done about it.
Thanks. What about grazing dual-purpose crops?
Yeah. So I mean, inherently, I would say they should be low risk for bloat. But I mean, there's been reports of pure ryegrass stands causing bloat. So it's really just a matter of seeing. And I was surprised that canola was associated with a problem. And it's not the first time I've heard of it. It's the second or third time that it's been suggested to me. So in terms of the cereals, should be reasonably low risk. I would certainly be adding magnesium and salt in if I was grazing cereals as a loose lick, plus or minus calcium. But they shouldn't be a bloat risk. We're grazing. We've had steers at the moment grazing on oats. Haven't had a problem, and it's not usually associated with that. So yeah, that should be okay.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. The next one from Matt. Given that nitrogen application can reduce bloat risk in pastures by reducing the dominance of clover in mixed swards, is there an optimal time to be applying urea to paddocks to balance paddock yield with bloat risk?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it ties in with exactly what I was saying, and that's a really good strategy, I think. The difficulty is identifying your risk period, And that's what I'm really struggling with at the moment. 4 or 5 years ago, I would have said we've got a fairly narrow risk period, and I would have explained that by saying it was associated with the agronomic factors in the paddock, and I would have been pretty comfortable that there was a 4 to 6 week window. I'm now seeing that window being more like 4 to 6 months, or probably realistically 4 to 5 months, and that's really difficult to know when you ought to be applying nitrogen and what payback you're going to get from that.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the question. Next one from Tammy, just a quick one. Is the hose down the neck still effective?
Yeah. Look, I mean, the idea is that if you get an animal that's severe, you put a tube down the neck. I can tell you that if the animal's hit the ground and is still alive, trying to put a tube down a animal's throat is really difficult. If the animal is still standing, in most cases, drenching it with oil will solve the problem as quickly. Some sort of vegetable oil. I mean, we just keep straight out of one of the major supermarkets a 5 litre container of oil sitting around at the yards. If we ever need it, it's there and ready to go. So a tube will work. You've got to get the tube down. Generally speaking, treating with oils probably just as effective, but certainly a tube will work.
Thank you. Do rumen pH buffer products help without ionophore?
Not to my knowledge. So it's not a. So the thing about the buffer products is that they can what you've got to do is you've got to alter the microbe population. Those buffers sustain the population and help it under certain circumstances, but don't necessarily change it. The ionophore changes the mix of the microbes that are in the rumen, and that's what you need to do. So I'm just thinking, I just can't think of any research which has indicated that they help specifically in terms of bloat. In terms of acidosis, that's a different problem, but bloat is not associated with acidosis as such, so I can't see that that would be relevant.
Okay, 3 final questions. First one from Tom. Is there any research that indicates which bloat supplement is more readily taken by cattle? Block form versus loose licks or liquid supplements?
There's no research to my knowledge. We'd be happy to carry out that sort of research for sure. And the only thing I can say is it possibly is going to vary depending on the type of pastures that the animals are on, their previous experiences. And so it's going to be quite difficult to make a general recommendation for everyone, even if you did the specific work. It's really a matter of just seeing what works. I can guarantee you that, well, I can't guarantee you. I can say that the majority of products that I'm aware of on the market are all palatable and all been eaten by animals, and that's why they're on the market. So it's really a matter of seeing what works in your circumstances. Some people swear by the liquids, others swear by the loose licks, and other people find the blocks work well. I'm not talking about in terms of stopping bloat. I'm talking in terms of the animals wanting to eat them. And then the stopping the bloat is all about if they're getting the right amount, and that's what I think we're struggling with all the compounds, because we're on the borderline for them getting the right amount. And if the animals, for some reason, and this is what I think happens with animals, I think is that they eat the supplement for a number of days, and then for whatever reason, that some animals go off the supplement and then come back onto it again. Now, that's fine for most supplements, but for bloat, if you happen to be the wrong day that you've decided to go off the supplement, you've had enough of it. It's a bit like eating chocolates. I love a chocolate at night, but if you overdo it, you can get a little bit sick of them, only for a day or two, I will admit, and then you're back onto them. But if that day or two happen to be a bloat risk day, for whatever reason, for the pasture, for the weather, or just by chance, then you're in trouble. So I think that's a pretty well understood thing that happens with animals, that they don't eat these things consistently. But I haven't got any trial work to demonstrate that. So I'm just going off first principles from what I know about supplementing animals.
All right, thank you, Bruce. The next one from Michelle. Regarding the possible monitoring of collars or tags, wouldn't you want to be notified much sooner than 1 hour before the animal goes down? So what is best time frame, Bruce?
Absolutely. I agree. I was saying at least an hour. We don't know yet until we get the algorithms as to how long we could. Potentially, and this is the difficulty with something like bloat as opposed to things like worms, is it happens very, very suddenly. I probably didn't make that point in the presentation, but you can go from a situation where an animal is essentially normal to an animal has blown up and died over a period of hours, not days. So it's still going to be a relatively short warning, because otherwise your phone's going to be going off all the time and you're going to get sick of it and you're not going to respond because they're not going to be dying. What you really want to know is when they're getting close. So that sort of thing will have to be developed as we go along. But ideally, I can tell you an hour's warning is a lot better than no warning, but 5 hours warning would be great. I don't think we'll get 24 hours warning. So hopefully we'll certainly, I mean, the beauty of this sort of research is we would find out a lot of the questions we've been asked tonight. What hour do the animals start to get bloat, under what conditions? Because once we've got a monitoring system that can identify animals that have got bloat, we can start to do serious research with bloat. And that's why Sean and I started doing this research, with the hope that we could get a tool that would then allow us to not let animals die, but to treat the animals before they got bloat and continue on the bloat research. So it's really important in terms of the research that we get this sort of methodology, because we'd then be able to tell you all sorts of things about the different times and the question on the rotational grazing, all the really good questions there on the differences of what you ought to be grazing pastures. We'd actually be able to give you an answer very quickly.
Tom wants to know, do you like your chocolate at night in liquid or block form?
Yeah, great question. I like a bit of both, actually, Tom. You know, the liquid in the middle, those gold wrap ones, they're pretty good. I'll get into trouble here. I might be endorsing a product.
No off-label usage, please. Okay, the final question from Luke.
Don't try that at home.
Don't. The final question from Luke, and it is a little bit off topic, but Luke's been on all night. Could you please touch on what grass tetany is?
Yeah, sure. I'd much rather give a webinar on grass tetany than bloat. I actually know something about grass tetany. I've done some research on it. So grass tetany is a magnesium deficiency. Occurs most commonly in as cows get older. As their lactation goes up, it typically occurs more frequently in autumn calving herds with short winter grass. When lactation hits the peak, it's exacerbated by cold weather, and you get often you lose animals as they come into cycle, the extra stress of cycling. So any stress factor on top of it. The problem with magnesium is, unlike calcium, where animals have a storage basis on their bones, they need magnesium in the diet every day. And our pastures over the winter in southern Australia are quite deficient in magnesium, and certainly rapidly growing crops are very deficient in magnesium. So lactating animals, and particularly cows, high-producing cows, the guys who lose them in studs that are recording them will always tell me they're the highest milkers. It's all to do with milk production and them getting insufficient energy. They milk off their back. They get everything they need off their back except the magnesium, and they have a magnesium deficiency, which leads to an immediate crisis. They go crazy, and if you don't treat them early on, they're quite difficult to even handle, and they can die very rapidly. So that is in a nutshell grass tetany. But as I say, it's a lot easier talking about grass tetany than bloat. I think we understand it a lot better than we do bloat.
Thanks, Bruce. Sorry, Luke's also written in, sounds like he's from Canamble, and he's like, can you get grass tetany in steers?
What you can get a condition in steers called transit tetany, which is a magnesium deficiency and is grass tetany, but for some reason we call it transit tetany. It occurs when there's stress on the animals, and if they're grazing something that is very low in magnesium, and then they've got excessive stress, and an example of that excessive stress would be transporting those animals. So you can imagine if somebody had steers on a dual-purpose cereal, and then whack them in a truck to move them back to another place or on, that's the sort of case you get these cases in steers. But generally, we don't see grazing at pasture any issues with magnesium deficiency in young growing animals.
Okay, thank you very much for answering those questions, Bruce. One last one from Tom, and I think this will be useful for all the listeners. Bruce, how can we as producers and levy payers convince MLA to throw some funding at Bloat Research?
Yeah, good question. And I'm probably not the right person to ask, because I clearly am wanting to do some research into bloat because I see it as a big problem. And I've already approached MLA on a number of occasions and tried to highlight this. And if I'm telling you how to do it, that might be seen as a best interest. But I mean, the formal way is that there are what's called the RAC, SALRAC and WALRAC, where producers have representatives at those committees, and they're producer-driven committees which set the agenda for research priorities. Now, I can assure you that Southern New South Wales SALRAC now has bloat as a priority, so that will be going forward. So that is one way of influencing it, is through that mechanism. But I would have thought, emails or letters to MLA asking them what's happening about it. Most organisations respond to producer organisations. Most producer organisations respond to producers saying there's a problem a lot better than they respond to researchers saying there's a problem, because rightly they think those researchers just want to do it for their own interest, not for the industry's interest. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it's you guys are probably in a better position than me to know how best to influence these things.
Yeah, and those SALRAC, so Southern Australian Livestock Council.
Research Council. Research Council.
They have websites with contacts and who sits on the board. So if you just Google it, you can find your local contact who sits on that board or in that position to email. All right, so that's all for tonight. Thank you very, very much, Bruce, for fielding all those questions and for your presentation on managing bloat. I think we all got a lot out of it, and hopefully over the next few years we'll see some more research and further extension come from this area. And yeah, thanks again, Bruce, and we'll actually see you next week with some best time to wean prime lambs. So I'm jack of all trades.
That sounds good. I promise I won't have a go at anyone next week on next week's topic.
Are you sure? All right. Thanks very much.
No, I can be on that one. It'll be safe. All righty. Well, thanks to all the questions were terrific, and I'm sorry I struggled with most of them, but they really were terrific. So, yep, everyone was thinking. Good on you. Okay, we'll log off, and I'll talk to you another day.
Thanks, Bruce.